Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Smithsonian National Education Summit and our presentation, Be a History Detective, Promoting Historical Thinking Skills in Young Learners. The question and answer feature will be available for the duration of the session today, and we encourage you to submit any questions you have for the presenters at any time. We will devote time at the end of the session to answering as many of these questions as we can. I'm Maureen Leary, the Youth and Family Programs Manager at the National Postal Museum. The four of us presenting today all work at a history museum, and for each of us, part of our job is helping young learners both feel connected to and think critically about objects in our collections. This means we encourage learners to question what they are seeing, think about things like context and background, and work to construct meaning from museum objects. Young children are constantly taking in new information and navigating new situations. With virtually everything they do, they are inherently constructing meaning. As educators, we can capitalize on this rich period of intellectual and interpersonal growth by supporting the development of social emotional skills at the same time as we help children deepen historical thinking skills, like considering different perspectives, making connections, and interpreting information. On this slide, we have listed what the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning identifies as the five main skill areas comprising social emotional learning: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and decision-making. While the connection between these skills and historical thinking skills might not be immediately obvious, it's a very important one to consider while working with little ones. We explain this a bit more on the next slide. Incorporating social emotional learning activities into history curriculum can support children to enhance their ability to better understand the emotions of others, as well as understand and manage their own emotions. The teaching of history is, of course, driven by facts, but what makes history interesting to most learners are the narratives that go along with the information. Most compelling stories have human emotions woven throughout them. And for young learners, this can be a really interesting entry point into historical narratives. Talking about the wide range of emotions people feel, how people react to different emotions, and how the same event can evoke different emotions in different people is really the bedrock of social emotional learning. Focusing on this aspect of historical narratives can help children understand that while our specific experiences with them may differ, our emotions help connect us to each other. This is a really important part of building empathy, which leads us right into the next point. Develop empathy, compassion, and respect for others, including people of different racial, social, and cultural identities and experiences. Children are naturally self centered, and I don't use that term in a negative way. It takes a certain level of maturity to realize that the experiences you had in life might not be universal. History provides a great entry point to talking not only about how people's lives were different in the past, but how in every time period, including our present day, two people might experience the same situation or setting very differently. Talking about this with kids is a natural exercise in perspective taking, which is not always easy or automatic for children. By taking historical objects and events and considering them from different perspectives, we are equipping children with a skill that is transferable to so many situations. It also lays the groundwork for helping children understand that just because a part of history has always been taught one way, that doesn't make it accurate. It's our job as history detectives to search for more complete answers. Learn effective communication skills to solve problems in various situations. As museum educators, we constantly try to model good communication. We do this in many ways, but one of the central ways is by asking questions. So many questions. We seldom expect an audience to accept an object at face value, but usually try to dig a bit deeper. Museum objects often look like everyday objects, but their inclusion in a museum's collection inherently means they have some kind of historical or cultural significance that may not be obvious on the surface. We often check with our audience for prior knowledge on a topic before digging into factual information. This shows children that we value the knowledge that they bring and that we are learning together. Again, this is transferable to so many real life situations as children begin to understand that the opinions, knowledge, and experiences of others can be helpful to them as they navigate the world. We can't know everything about a given topic, but it's important to continue to learn and let our ideas and approaches evolve as we learn more. We can problem solve alongside our students as we pose questions and seek answers. Create and maintain positive relationships with others. Speaking from my own experience in leading museum programs with children, it is always delightful when you witness their excitement and those moments when they show that they feel connected to the topic and to the others in the learning experience with them. Valuing the thoughts children have about objects and explicitly stating that appreciation can be a very powerful way to build relationships. Anyone who works with young children knows that you cannot predict what they will say when they ask questions or provide comments. Often you have to try to pivot from something totally unrelated to get back to your topic. This is a skill I've worked on a lot over the years, and I do find it so helpful in building rapport with learners to take a moment to appreciate what they've said and find a connection with the larger learning goals. And of course, making connections is an important historical thinking skill that we are constantly modeling. Make thoughtful and responsible decisions that contribute to a positive classroom environment and community. As educators, we make careful choices about what we teach and how we teach it. These choices speak volumes to the learners who are impacted by them. Creating a culture of inquiry, respect, and empowerment, whether it's in a classroom, a library, a museum, or some other setting, helps young learners understand how they in turn can impact others and why it's important to support the social emotional well being of all. We all learn better when we feel safe and respected, and it's up to every individual in a learning environment to help make that happen. So, with that overview of the connection between social emotional learning and historical thinking skills, I'd now like to turn it over to my colleague Eden for some object exploration.
Thank you, Maureen. Hi, everyone. My name is Eden Cho, and I'm an educator at the National Museum of American History. At American History, we strive to and empower others to create a just and compassionate future by exploring, preserving, and sharing the complexity of our past. So, what do history detectives do? We are investigators. We acknowledge that we don't know everything, and that's okay. We strengthen our observational skills. We fill in the gaps by asking questions and looking for the answers. We encourage everyone of all ages, kids and adults alike, to be lifelong learners. This is what our museum curators and educators do every day. Next slide, please. As an example, we're going to discuss something we all might have seen or heard of or tasted, the fortune cookie, and how it became popular in the United States. I'd like to invite my colleague Ariel Moon from the National Museum of African American History and Culture to spark her curiosity. On the slide are a few questions I had when I was a kid. As a baker, I was particularly interested in the mechanics of creating the fortune cookie. How do people bake the cookie into this very particular three-dimensional shape? How do bakers get the fortune inside the cookie so the paper remains intact and pristine? And why are fortune cookies often given as a free dessert at Chinese restaurants? Ariel, what are some other questions that come to mind for you?
Oh, okay. I was like, every time I unmute, it mutes. Hi. I am wondering a few things. I'm wondering what they taste like most cookies. I'm curious about that. And I wonder if they taste the same today as they did a really long time ago. Also, I see some letters that I recognize on the bag, but there's also some letters I don't recognize. So I'd be curious about what they say.
Those are really great questions. Let's see if we can answer some of them. Next slide, please. To help find the answers to some of our questions, I have an object for us to observe today. I'd like us to practice our See, Think, Wonder thinking routine from Harvard University's Project Zero thinking routines. We begin with See. What do you see in these images? Then think. What do you think about the objects in these images? And finally, wonder. What do you wonder about these objects? Next slide, please. So Arya, thank you again for helping us practice our See, Think, Wonder routine. Here is a close-up of the object. What do you see in these images?
I see a shape that looks like a mountain. So I see a mountain and I see some words that are like near the mountain.
Okay, what do you think about the object?
I think it kind of looks like a tool, like scissors or tongs, something. I think that you could use it to make this kind of motion with.
Great observations. I wonder the same. And finally, what do you wonder about this object?
So one of my first wonderings is how big is this object? Is it something that I could actually like hold in my hand, or is it even bigger than that? I wonder how old it is because I see it looks like kind of rusty, like it might be kind of old. And I'm very curious, of course, how this object is being used, how you could use it.
Great wonderings. Thank you for helping us out. Next slide, please. So fortune cookies are inspired by a similar dessert from Japan, not China. The dessert from Japan were slightly bigger, slightly darker, more savory than sweet, with flavors like sesame and miso, and the fortunes were placed differently. Japanese immigrants brought this idea and began selling them in the United States. To the best of our curators' knowledge, based on their research, because there were a few people who claimed fame for bringing the fortune cookie to the United States and popularizing them. The fortune cookie was created in the States in the early 1900s when Makoto Hagiwara, who owned a restaurant called the Japanese Tea Garden, asked Suichi Okamura, who owned a Japanese confectionery store called Ben Kyoto, to create a special dessert to be served at the tea garden. During World War II, when Japanese Americans were incarcerated, Chinese businessmen began creating their own version of the fortune cookie. The fortune cookie then became associated as a free dessert at Chinese restaurants. This is when I would scaffold learning for kids who are older, and I would go in depth with the reason we associate the fortune cookie with Chinese restaurants. Because at the time, Japanese Americans were unfairly incarcerated. So not only were they not working, but for many, their homes, properties, businesses were stolen. As kids get older, this is a pathway to learning more about World War II, Executive Order 9066, and how important reparations and a national apology were to Japanese Americans. This is an opportunity to tell a more complete narrative of something as simple as a cookie. So the object we saw, thought, and wondered about is called a senbei kata. The one we saw in the picture was a gift from the Okamura family. It's a special baking mold specifically created for fortune cookies. The one we saw in the image was the one Okamura used to bake his fortune cookies for the Japanese tea garden. So as Arya noted, the mold does indeed have an engraving of the words Japan tea with an image of Mount Fuji, a reference to the fortune cookies' origin, Japan, and the business now selling them, Japanese Tea Garden, located in San Francisco, California, USA. When fortune cookies were still baked handmade, the baker would pour the baking mixture into the senbei kata, bake it in the mold, and while it's still hot, place a fortune inside the cookie and shape them in half into the famous fortune cookie shape we all know and love today. Of course, now fortune cookies are mass produced. I'd like to encourage everyone to keep asking questions, challenge assumptions, because we think we might know the answers, but we might not. And even if we do know, there are always opportunities to look at the same stories and the same objects from different perspectives and different voices. Based on age and grade level, there are layers to the story that can be told, especially when reckoning with our racial past. And that's part of being an investigator of history. Even now, after presenting and talking about the fortune cookie, I have even more questions. Does anyone sell fortune cookies today with sesame and miso flavors? Because I personally would love to try them. And Aria, I have a feeling you would too. Is the original dessert that inspired the fortune cookie still being made and sold in Japan? And I know that the Okamura family were incarcerated during World War II, and they did have to close Benkyodo temporarily. But what happened to Hagiwara and the Japanese tea garden? The learning never ends. I'd like to let everyone know you can access and observe our objects on our National Museum of American History website. Links to additional learning resources will be available on our session page on the event website. And my colleague at the National Postal Museum used some of the Smithsonian's smallest objects to tell stories and examine whose voices are telling them. So I'd like to turn it over to Mira.
Thank you so much. My name is Mira Munoz Pandia, and I am an educator at the National Postal Museum, which explores our past through the lens of postal history. Today, we're going to be looking at an object from our collection together. As Eden mentioned, a very small object. So if we could bring up the first slide, that'd be excellent. So in a museum setting, we so often make use of object-based learning, focusing on our museum's collection. This can look different when in the galleries, in classrooms, and virtually. We use these objects and the examination of them as clues for our history detectives to examine and build upon. For today's presentation, we will be examining ways to work with imperfect or even outright problematic source material when working with young learners. In this example from the National Postal Museum's collection, we're hoping to figure out together what we can learn from looking at a stamp and how we can approach an object like this responsibly. Beginning with young learners by asking very broad questions like, what do you see? And what do you see that tells you that? Gives participants room to answer with the details that they are drawn to and lead the discussion in directions that they find interesting. So some folks will gravitate towards the words and numbers, those kinds of details, the clues that inform us about what this object was and how it was used. This is a stamp. We can tell from the perforations around the edge. It was issued in a particular year, 1892, although it also has the year 1492 listed. It has an image of an event that is labeled as the landing of Columbus, and it costs 2 cents. All of these are clues that are there waiting for our detectives to observe them and pull them out. And some folks, when observing an object like this, will gravitate towards the image. What people, objects, clothing do they see? What emotions are shown in this image? How does that relate to their own world, and how is it different? So they will notice this image that shows a party of 15th century Spaniards led by the figure of Christopher Columbus arriving on a beach. So we're looking at this object as an artwork as well as an artifact. We want to be sure to draw attention to the image as well as contextualizing details such as its minuscule size. Stamps tend to be about 1 inch by 1 inch, maybe a little bit bigger, and how stamps were used. In what context would this image and object have existed? We can put all of these clues together with our young learners, with our detectives, to start telling the story of this object. Contextualizing information and background are important to filling out that story, but the focus of this first exercise really is that close looking and the development of historical thinking skills. If we could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Another useful tool here can be to compare and contrast. Further close looking can help develop focused and observant learners. So here we can compare and contrast the stamp with the painting on which it was modeled. It can be useful to look at the similarities first. Our brains naturally notice them and jump to the differences. So it can be a useful exercise to slow down and draw out these similar details with young learners. Things like the figures, the poses, the setting, the clothes. And then moving on to differences, we can notice what changes were made. It's also useful to emphasize that these differences were all active choices made by somebody. Colors, size, figures, even these very obvious differences give us more information and activate young minds in important ways. One difference that I want to point out here with the image in front of us is that we can see clearly in the painting something that isn't so clear on the stamp. A few Taino figures, the indigenous inhabitants of the island, off to the right in the painting. You can see almost the suggestion of them in the stamp, but they are barely visible. Like with the stamp, introducing context after doing this close looking can add fullness to the picture. So in this case, I think it's quite useful to know that this painting is 12 feet by 18 feet, and it is in the Capitol Rotunda. Next slide, please. Once we have established a solid visual foundation with our detectives and spent a fair amount of time with these images, we can start to analyze bigger questions. By having already engaged in close looking, we have equipped our detectives to look for evidence themselves. We can ask questions like, how is this moment shown? With what tone? Who is shown? Who is missing? How are indigenous figures depicted? These are big, important questions to examine with young learners. And examining them will look different with children of different ages and might need adjusting depending on just how young these learners are. So with the example of how are indigenous figures depicted, I want to note that this shouldn't be the first context in which indigenous or Taino stories are introduced. Introducing them to young participants first or only in the context of Columbus's story can perpetuate old and harmful ways of thinking. The Taino are a real people with rich history and culture whose home is the setting for this image. This is crucial context to share with young learners before even starting to look at difficult depictions like this one. In the painting, these Taino figures are off to the side, hiding amongst the trees, and on the stamp, they are barely visible. Their home is being invaded by strangers, and they are barely characters in their own story as it is shown here. How does that knowledge change how students see this image? We can introduce empathy-based questions here. How might it feel to be depicted in this way? How would you feel about seeing a painting like this in if this was your history, your own home, activating those social and emotional skills? As for the question of how is this moment shown, with what tone, how does this image make us feel? And how do you think the people in the painting feel? We can learn by looking with our young learners. This landing involves tall postures, the planting of a flag. It gives off a proud and active energy. Asking young learners questions that start with how, like, how do you think these figures at the front feel? How do you think the figures off to the right feel? Gives them a chance to reflect on feelings and activate those social emotional skills while looking closely and rooting their responses in visual evidence. This triumphant depiction shows a moment that in reality stands at the beginning of a long history of violence, displacement, and trauma for Indigenous Americans across the continent. What we see here has no hint of that. It is a glorious moment for the Spaniards. All of these images are prominent in the Capitol on widely used and distributed stamps. Drawing a clear contrast between what we see in the image and what we know about the history is important when talking about these stories. We can also ask students questions that start with why. Why might some of these changes have been made from painting to stamp? going back to the comparing and contrasting that we did with them earlier. Why might the painting be in the Capitol building? Why might this image have gone on a stamp in the first place? Like my colleague Eden said, we don't have all of the answers. You can notice my frequent use of the word might following the word why in these questions. We're exploring these questions together with our history detectives. This kind of questioning gives them a chance to slot this learning into their wider world and build the social emotional skills like perspective taking and empathy. They can consider the designers of the stamp, the users of the object, the artist, the subjects, and the excluded or erased. This kind of questioning involves following up with the students' answers. For example, when discussing why this painting might be in our Capitol building, we want to be sure that we address the potential harm behind those reasons. If a student says something like, because people think Columbus's story is important, we want to be sure as educators to push beyond that. Why do people think this particular story is important? And what can be harmful about thinking in that way? Both the painting and the stamp show this scene in very similar ways. That is a dominant image in our culture, in our Capitol, on our stamps. But that doesn't mean that we can't explore this topic in a nuanced way that moves decisively away from that kind of depiction, even while we're looking at them. Young children have a very powerful sense of fairness and what is fair, what isn't fair. This can be a really useful framing for them. Examining what is missing can also be an extremely powerful fashion and an effective way to introduce topics that are complex and difficult. Often when dealing with museum collections, this is what we are left with. Images that show a story through a lens that is not what we want to be imparting to our young learners. Looking at what is missing and what is incorrect helps us to discuss these kinds of problematic objects and learn from them without perpetuating their harm. Absence matters. Images all around us leave out important stories or tell them through a certain lens. This kind of content can introduce young learners to the fact that these absences exist and give us an opportunity to talk with them about why that matters. This is another opportunity to bring in empathy. How might this feel for the people whose stories are excluded or being told incorrectly? This is also an opportunity to talk about how the images that do exist aren't always honest or truthful. These are concepts that our young learners really understand, and this framing can further equip them with these historical thinking skills. These are really hard topics, and having a strong visual foundation in the evidence and the material culture can help young learners get to these difficult topics. Everything we're talking about here is based in the image, what we see and what we don't. Next slide, please. So context can continue to add to this picture as we continue to explore it. Stamps are public art. Millions of people use them, and they are a way to tell a story to a lot of people. And there are a lot of Columbus stamps. These are only some of the ones released in 1892 by the United States to celebrate 400 years since Columbus's landing, celebrating the anniversary of something that many people do not see as worth celebrating in any way. And a lot of people see this story very differently today, not as a triumphant story where Columbus is the hero, like we see on the initial stamp or on these stamps here. The Spaniards aren't the only people who matter in this story. This is also a story that belongs to the Taino people who are barely visible. You wouldn't know that just by looking at the painting or the stamp or any of these other Columbus stamps without examining questions that go beyond what we see immediately in front of us. We can use these historical moments and objects to relate to modern themes and topics. The debate about Columbus Day as a holiday continues to rage today. Objects like these can tell us what stories were thought of as important, how they were shown, and how that's different from today. This image would probably not have been made into a stamp today, although I will say that in 1992, various Columbus stamps were released for the 500th anniversary of his landing. And the painting we looked at together is still up in the Capitol, all 12 feet by 18 feet of it. Additionally, I want to be sure to say that this shouldn't be the only place or context where Indigenous stories like that of the Taino are discussed. This should not be the first place that they are discussed with young learners. And they should not only be framed in terms of how they relate to white stories and history, and not only in the context of violence and trauma. It's important to be sure that absence and violence aren't the only things addressed when discussing marginalized people and histories. So please don't take the above as a full model lesson. Discussing what is wrong with dominant imagery is extremely important to do sensitively and well with young learners, but it's not a substitution or a replacement for looking at imagery that celebrates marginalized peoples. The National Museum of the American Indian has amazing resources on teaching Indigenous histories, and we have some links available on our session page. By starting our examination by looking in a very detailed way and activating students' social and emotional skills throughout, we're able to tackle these big, difficult questions and topics with them with a solid foundation in what it is that we're examining. So I'll now hand things over to my colleague Ariel Moon at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and she will talk us through a technique for discussing challenging content with young learners.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Mira. My name is Ariel Moon, and I am the lead education specialist for early childhood programming at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The collections in my museum tell all kinds of stories. There are stories of struggle and activism, injustice and violence, hard changes, not enough changes, but there's also a lot of stories of celebration and triumph, of discovery and innovation, joy, empowerment. Our collection truly tells a story that is multifaceted and deep and complex. And so when I'm trying to share these stories with children, it can be challenging to figure out where exactly to begin or how to really explain something that is even hard for me to say or think about sometimes. And I know that's how a lot of parents and caregivers and educators feel. And excuse me. Sometimes it just kind of feels easier to not tell the story at all. But these stories are important to our children's growth. So I want to share a technique that has helped me in my history programs with children. In order for children to be helped to be history detectives, in order for them to be history detectives that are better able to understand some of the stories in our collection or from our history, I like using picture books that are not about the exact story or topic that I'm talking about to act as a precursor and template for telling the history story or lesson that I really want to share later on. By starting a story with by starting with a story that is accessible because it has familiar, fun characters that maybe even in a whole different setting or point in time, children are able to more easily build empathy, social awareness, relationship, and decision-making skills that are really necessary for their social emotional development, but also necessary for them to have so they can make sense more complex stories in history or even in modern day life. I'm going to give you all an example of a book that we've used in some of our virtual programs at NAMAC to introduce the story that this photo comes from. So on the right side of your screen, I think, you'll see a photo of a group of men who are all holding signs that say, "I am a man." And this is an image from the sanitation workers strike of 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, I won't dive into that story just yet because I'm going to introduce it to you in just a couple slides. Next slide, please. All right, so in order to introduce this story of the sanitation workers, I selected one of my favorite books called Please Please the Bees by Gerald Kelly. And the reason I selected this book is because the moral of the story is very similar to the takeaway message from the sanitation workers history lesson that I ultimately want to share. So that's the first step. Figure out what your goal is in telling this history story. For me, I wanted students to know that there are different things people can do when they feel like they're being treated unfairly. So I looked through some books and I found one that showed that. As I talk today, feel free to share any books you think may work well for telling history stories, but aren't exactly about history stories. And I will shout some of them out during the Q&A. So surprisingly, this book has a very similar storyline and message to that of the sanitation workers. So here's the story. Benedict the bear, if we can show the slide again, that would be awesome. Loves honey. Every day he wakes up and on his doorstep are jars of honey brought to him by the bees that live in his backyard. So one day, Benedict wakes up and there's no jars at his door, and all of the bees have gone on strike. And you can see they're all holding signs that say they're striking. And it's at this point in the story where I talk with students about the word strike and protesting. And this is my way of introducing vocab that I know will be relevant in my history lesson later on. Then one day, a bee wants to talk to him. Benedict doesn't really want to talk. He tells them they should be grateful instead of striking. And the bees kind of tell him all about their problems with the hive and the yard. And they feel like they're being taken advantage of. And that if Benedict wants honey, they need to see some changes from him. And so at this point, and throughout the story, I've been asking students questions to guide their critical thinking. First, I am asking why the bees may have stopped working. Then I'm asking what could their employer, Benedict the bear, do to fix the problems. And with this story, students actually came to the conclusion pretty quickly that the situation was really unfair, and they offered a lot of really great solutions and ideas of ways that Benedict could better support the bees. So Benedict ends up doing a lot of thinking and research and works really hard to fix the yard. And at the end of the story, the bees return to work and Benedict gets his honey again. So by the end of this story time, even though it was about a bear and bees, students have now practiced thinking about unfair working conditions. They know what a strike is, and they've thought about how an employer can make changes so that everyone benefits. They're now ready for the bigger history story. Next slide, please. So now that it's time to tell the history story, try to use the story structure or order of events from the children's book to help you retell the history. With a similar structure, children can really put their history detective skills to work a lot more easily when the stories parallel. You can tell them what to look out for. Like in this book or in this history story, there will be an unfair situation and a moment when someone stands up for themselves, and ask students to point those things out and then pause and discuss them as those things come up. So just to give you a summary of the history story I discussed, that's presented here in the images on the screen. After explaining what a sanitation worker is and why garbage collecting is so important, I told students that in 1968, in a place called Memphis, Tennessee, the garbage collectors, just like today, did really hard work. Every day they drove around and picked up everyone's trash. Because they're dealing with stuff that is dirty and dangerous, it wasn't always easy to stay healthy, and they would sometimes even get injured from the trucks. Plus, even though garbage collecting is a really important job, the bosses didn't pay them a fair amount of money to do that job. So, despite their attempts to get help and more pay from their bosses, things didn't change, and the workers decided to go on strike. They all gathered together to march through the streets with signs. And the sign on your screen, which is from our museum collection, says, "I am a man." And the workers felt like the bosses of the garbage trucks, this is how I would explain it to children, weren't thinking that they were also humans or men like them that deserved better working conditions and enough money to take care of themselves and their families, just because the color of their skin was different from theirs. So they wanted their signs to remind the bosses they were people too, and they wanted to be treated in a way that showed just how important they are. The garbage collectors, the sanitation workers were on strike for over 2 months. It took that long for the bosses of the garbage trucks to decide to change the way they were paying and treating the sanitation workers. So, as you tell this history story, remember to ask the same questions you asked during the book story, like asking, what do you think the employers could do to make this situation feel more fair for the sanitation workers? What you should notice is that your students' brains begin recognizing the way this is very similar to something that we've discussed before, and therefore coming to some of the conclusion that you wanted them to come to, but without the same lift for you as the educator. Because you've given them some prep thinking before introducing something that may have originally been a little less accessible or may have felt a little bit harder for them to recognize or wrap their heads around before. In my work, I want to do a lot less of telling children that this is unfair and not right, and more of having learners do that for themselves. And the only way that can happen is by giving them opportunities prior to the big stuff. For them to come to that conclusion on their own. I want them to know why something is unfair for themselves and not just because a grown up says so. And so a way we do that is also by starting with something accessible like a storybook, introducing something that happened a long time ago in history, and then adding something that they may have seen today or in their own lifetime so far. And that's what we'll see on the next slide. So this is where the next piece of the lesson comes in. The poster on the left is from the March of the Sanitation Workers strike that we have in our museum. And also from our museum are a few signs on the right side that are from more recent protests and more recent situations in which people felt that they were being treated unfairly and decided to do something about it. You all are welcome to use signs and objects from the Smithsonian collection for lessons like these. Remember to utilize the Smithsonian Learning Lab, but you all know your own communities well. So you may know something that has happened in your area or in your town that a lot of students in your community may have been impacted by, or they may know something about. And so feel free to pull in those stories so that they can see that this is not just a one-off situation that happened a long time ago. It's not just something that happens in a book. It's also something that happens today and is something that they can participate in and feel more empowered to do too. Next slide, please. To end this presentation, I just wanted to share with you some posters that were emailed to us after our school programs a couple of years ago. Someone was very passionate about pollution. So their sign says, "Stop polluting, everyone." Black Lives Matter is another sign. And then we have a student who wanted the coronavirus to be over now. This was from 2021. They also added at the bottom, "Please stop stealing." So that's it for me. I hope that this is something you're able to try out in the new year. There are so many books out there and that may not exactly be about moments in history that we want and need to share with students, but can still play a part in that kind of learning. I'm going to invite all of my colleagues back on screen now and see if we have just a little bit more time to answer some questions from the Q&A.
Great. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. And excuse me, as we get started with our Q&A, we have about 5 minutes to devote to questions. I did want to start out by just reminding everyone that the session is being recorded and will be available soon. And the PowerPoint that goes along with our session will also be available, as well as the document we referenced that has a lot of great links in it to other resources that we wanted to share with you that support all the content that we presented today. So we do have a few questions that have come in. I'll start with a simple one. We have Adam who asked us, I was just wondering what age range you mean when you say young learners, and that's a great question. And I think typically we at the Smithsonian, we generally think of it as birth to age 8. I think that maybe it can be a little bit fluid depending, on your school system and the different ways different organizations define things. But that's typically what we mean at the Smithsonian. When we say early learners, we mean birth to age 8, and obviously programs will look different for different subsets of that group. We had a really interesting question. I'm going to direct this one to Mira. It says, this is from Annika. It says, how do we appropriately approach the full picture of peoples when we are focused by objects, curriculum, and limited time that may be specific to a colonial history in a museum context. Mira repeated that we should not be introducing First Peoples within colonial context, but I work in a colonial focused museum. By nature of visiting this museum, we begin everything in this colonial context, including any introductions of First Peoples. Thoughts on that? That's a big question.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. A lot of museums are in a position where we're really limited by the kinds of stories that we were set up to tell and what our collections look like. I think I don't necessarily have a solution or a fix because it is really hard to be doing this within that context. I think a couple things that I want to say about that are that one, learners that are very young learners, I think younger than we think, are equipped with the skills that they need to have a conversation about what is missing, what is wrong with this framing. And they're equipped with the ability to really start to understand why what they're looking at is imperfect. And I think that in moments when our collections are not necessarily responsibly equipped to tell a full story, then you can go beyond your collections and really make sure that you're bringing in other kinds of content to make sure that you tell a full story. I'd love to know if any of my other panelists have anything that they'd like to add.
I always say just because people aren't in your museum doesn't mean they don't belong. Doesn't mean they don't belong there. So I think that it's really important, like Mira said, to bring in other materials before, maybe up until the point that then your museum begins the rest of the storytelling. But the reason why our collections look the way they do often is because of the people who curated them. And when we think about who those people were and the choices they made, it's going to be likely that often happens where your story, there isn't a full story because of the people who chose the objects to begin with.
Thank you so much, Ariel and Mira. We have a number of people asking if we have recommendations for finding good children's books as companions to some of these important topics.
That is really, it takes a lot of time. I spend a lot of time on YouTube in particular, watching other people read books to kind of decide. And I will say that it's a matter of just reading a bunch of books. Of course, I do like a Google search of like trying to narrow down my topics maybe, but really I think it's just familiarity with books. So just looking through your collection you may already have and write down some of the themes that each of the books have, that then when you're looking for a theme, you kind of have already categorized some of the books in certain themes that you then want to pull and tie to history lessons.
And I'll just add to that there are some organizations out there who are really devoted to curating lists of children's books that are devoted to difficult topics. And
yeah, like socialjustice.org, I think is a great place for sure. Mm-hmm.
Yes, absolutely. So we are just at about a minute left. There's one question, and I'm sorry we're not gonna be able to get to everyone's questions. A lot of great questions came in. Thank you all so much for engaging with us today. One other question I just want to throw out there to the group, because I think it's one that we do struggle with a lot as museum educators. What suggestions do we have for having these kinds of conversations with larger field trip size groups? Anyone have any quick thoughts on that before we wrap up?
My quick thought is to email us. Do we have an email slide with emails on it?
Yes, we've
'Cause
provided.
I know we would all love to really, these are such great questions. And if you just emailed us directly to the emails we'll share either on the session page or maybe they're showing up on a slide that I'm not seeing, but we can definitely dive more into that question. A great one for sure.
Yes, and on that topic, I do want to add, the learning doesn't start and stop at the field trip. There's so many learning resources we can provide for pre and post visit. So yes, please email us.
Yes, and we did provide our emails both in the PowerPoint that is available and also in the resource document that is on our session page on the website. So we are out of time. Thank you so much to our audience. We hope that you found this valuable, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the National Education Summit. Thank you.